Hello everyone, today we talk about a very special historical figure for our first video about air warfare. I'm actually very passionate about this. I remember at the end of high school I wrote a thesis about the use of strategic bombing during World War II. I'm, even as a medievalist, particularly passionate about World War II fighters. I have also perhaps an unsuspectable, competence on the topic that I never discussed. However, today we talk about a generation before, one that in a sense made in fact the one of the pilots of World War II. Speaking of what is in many ways, paradoxically, the most renowned soldier of the Great War, as much as a member of the defeated army, and also one that did not fight, at least prevalently, who became famous for the fight in the trenches that we have discussed and will keep discussing, but that rose above the same in this almost angelic vision, in the truly also emphoric meaning that, a winged horseman from the migration era, chasing down the Roman soldiers at Adrianople, coming from the howling steppes, would have looked like. There is a lot of, of angelic symbolism, of chivalric emphasis, in many, of course, ideal aspects of World War I, but by an establishment that the same character belonged to, as we will see now, that was in fact, and especially in this case, the last expression of that medieval warfare that, as I told many times on Schwerpunkt, I don't count really definitionally having ended in Europe, if not until 1792 or 1918, which is also the death of this character, which is really paradoxical, right? His fame managed to cross enemy lines as well, truly as a knightly recognition of valor and greatness. He wasn't even the absolute best in his business, but his legion lived on for many reasons. So we will try to look at this now, so that of all, after all, think about the concept of a silent generation or generations going back in time, and how many people died during World War I, but how we haven't really made heroes out of this enormous amount of carnage. Well, Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen, 1892-1918, better known as the Red Baron, of course, is exactly such a powerfully enigmatic person that we'll try also to look at a bit characterly speaking, because he was actually a cold, driven, determined, stout, controlled man, right? But there was a lot going on within him throughout his, after all, brief life, as you can understand, that, however, managed to reach this imperial fame. He wrote, "I was just 11 years old when I joined the cadet corps. I wasn't particularly excited about becoming a cadet, but my father was determined that I would. As a result, my own wishes were overlooked." This statement somehow survived the stringent scrutiny, the heavy censorship, in fact, of the German government in Manfred von Richthofen's autobiography. Perhaps exactly since Manfred's father's impositions had managed to provide Germany and the world with such enormous myth. The Red Fighter Pilot was published, this is the name of Richthofen's autobiography, in 1917. Right, he was writing it in between, the fighting in the air, to help, in fact, solidify the same myth surrounding Richthofen that had already heavily developed and in fact very much interests the same German imperial propaganda. We talked about this also in the video about the Freikorps and so on. And also to satisfy that sort of the most genuine, as immense public fascination already existing at the time, again beyond Germany, beyond the trenches and the horrors of them, with a young aviation hero that, in this sense, symbolized perhaps the possibility of an understanding, a recognition of valor, and something that still existed beyond the nationalistic divides in what could be a more universal, maybe imperial Europe. It's not that Richthofen was not motivated to fight for Germany, as we'll see, to kill enemies specifically. But an observation of his background is necessary to really understand where also that will to fight and sense of chivalry and warriorism to an extent came from. In an age of radical transition, today we will not focus too much on aircraft technology, but it's also a chapter that we must deal with on Schwerpunkt sooner or later. But aerial warfare was completely new, right? It was taking shape exactly in this war, to the extent that would involve, in fact, proper fighters, and in fact, dogfights, and also more elaborate, of course, collective tactics that we will look at now are sort of also the most interesting thing, but all intertwined with the men at the cloche, right? The spirit guiding that. Von Clausewitz does not end because another arm in the sky has appeared, right? This is always valid in any time in history. While we may not know, by the way, what future Manfred von Richthofen imagined for himself as a child, remember what he said in the autobiography, so this future that his father prevented from happening, possibly also killing him in the process, even though the chance of being an able-bodied German between 1914 and 1918 made you quite likely to risk life, to say the least. This sentence seems to acknowledge his father instead, and perhaps this is actually why, again, it was preserved, though not with a hint of barely concealed bitterness for his foresight in guiding him, in fact, towards such an extraordinary destiny. Richthofen was born in 1892, on May the 2nd, in Kleinburg, near Breslau, now in Poland. Look at this East German, this truly East German world that disappeared during the two world wars, and that was a veritable relic of the medieval Ostsiedlung, together with the Junker, in fact, estate that Manfred belonged to. He grew up on the family estates in Lower Silesia. The Richthofen family belonged to a large and extended lineage of Freiherr, and this is also a very medieval thing, as you know. We were talking about this just the other day, speaking of the, say, German entrance in the Catholic war during the migration era. The idea that even though there was a very heavy hierarchy that, as we've seen, the same Manfred, starting from his father, complied with God, Kaiser, church, family, but there are many more layers, right? Especially in the Protestant German world, the sense of the rigidity of the obedience is quite important. It's never actually blind, as someone has wanted to stress to partially motivate, for example, even later National Socialism. No, they knew very well what they were doing, but it's the way in which they were disciplined that also informed them in this very peculiar fashion. And the Freiherr, of course, is that's also why Richthofen was called a baron colloquially, because the Red Baron, he was literally this free nobleman, right? How the common title was in Prussia for families of his status. This was really the backbone of the Prussian Junker establishment. Alongside his younger brothers, Lothar and Bolko, Lothar would follow him in combat in the air. Manfred experienced a typical childhood for a young Junker, marked by rigorous education and strict discipline, as we were saying, but also by outdoor adventures that apparently were his favorite thing. In his mansion in Schweidnitz, Manfred engaged in horseback racing and hunted large game. Perhaps there is a connection there with his future career. Understanding the mindset of great beasts like wild boars and deer, right? Activities, by the way, in which he excelled far more than in his academic studies. Space, speed, chasing, hunting, that's all, directing, having a sense of orientation. Those are all things that you can cultivate in a Junker's country mansion, but still can produce in this new world quite useful skills applied in other activities. And despite any aspirations he may have harbored for a different future, a military career was also the most common path for the Junkers, with the only viable alternatives being the management of the family estate or a position in public office. At the military academy in Wahlstatt, Richthofen encountered a level of discipline that he found difficult to adapt to. His fondest memories from that time center yet again about en plein air activities such as sports, picnics, youthful mischief, areas in which Manfred was able to thrive much more than in his coursework. Cadet Richthofen focused solely on what was necessary for his promotion, thus, clever strategy, by the way, reserving his competitive spirit and ambition for activities such as gymnastics, equestrianism, football, and any bold adventures that might come his way. In many ways, he was a boundary tester, and he also had method in this apparently undisciplined behavior for Prussian military standards. But as we know also from Clausewitzian philosophy, there is a place in the German military theory of the time for trust towards these officers, together with tactical, strategical autonomy that can highlight the genius of a command. A notable instance of Manfred's misdeeds was when he and his friend Frankenberg, as teenagers, scaled the bell tower of a church using the lightning rod cable to hoist a handkerchief as a makeshift flag at the summit. In 1911, Richthofen graduated from the academy and joined his first unit, the 1st Ulan Regiment, Tsar Alexander III of Russia. There's also kind of a relic of sort of shared, national recognitions. It was within this cavalry unit that he first encountered the realities of war, by the way, against the Russians, which is also pretty appropriate in this sense. In fact, assigned to the Eastern Front, Richthofen led a reconnaissance mission with 15 cavalrymen. However, after only 5 days, he lost all but one of his men, as they were reassigned to liaison and courier duties. This beginning is very interesting because, as you know, the Junker, also since the Middle Ages, were prominently horsemen, cavalrymen. It was a hell of an equestrian culture. There is a lot, actually, about World War I heraldry, especially connected with aerial warfare. For example, I don't know if you know, but the Ferrari horse is coming from the symbol that the Italian ace Baracca used on his airplane. As you see, very romantic, chivalric symbolism. And we'll talk about other aces at the end for other nations, so that we expand a bit the horizon as well. Because if anything, what stands out is how high mortality was within their ranks. And this is also what makes you think in this sense of elevation and chivalry and sacrifice and bloodshed in the process. But the fact again that Richthofen started, as also some of other aces of this kind from cavalry, is definitely not a coincidence, nor especially about his background as we've seen, but also in general the qualities that are connected. This happens for many units that passed from cavalry to at least avio transported, etc. So it's really a part of ancient tradition surviving this other dimension, but retaining the spiritual essence of tradition. In the aforementioned military episode, Manfred von Richthofen's military career could have ended so in this remote village of Russian-controlled Poland, which was occupied at the time by a contingent of Cossacks. Fortunately, after spending a week evading the enemy, Richthofen and his sole remaining horsemen managed to escape and return safely to their lines. Their deaths had actually already been presumed, and condolences even had been extended to the Richthofen's family, as was customary in Germany. They really weren't thinking that they could have escaped from the Cossacks out there, also considering the other losses. Richthofen's regiment was subsequently transferred to the Western Front, where Manfred faced his first combat, which was decidedly unglamorous. While pursuing a French cavalry unit with his Uhlans, and we're talking 1914 here, so consider that cavalry operations were a thing at the beginning of the war, he fell into an ambush, surrounded on three sides, and under heavy fire, he made the decision to retreat. However, his orders were misunderstood by his men, leading them to scatter in all directions, with some inadvertently riding directly into the hands of the French. This showed brutally how the age of glorious cavalry charges was long gone, and we know I made a video recently about trench warfare in general, how it happened, right? The reasons came to be quite evident, but especially understood by a military that knew how to adapt very quickly, and that's the reason why also Richthofen reoriented himself. Right. The only notable lance in rest charge attempted by his first Uhlans regiment had been against a herd of deer, erroneously identified by a short-sighted officer as enemy infantry, which also tells you a lot, and consequently the regiment was dismounted and relegated to rear line duties. So it seems like Richthofen actually wasn't risking too much had he remained there. Yet, the young Prussian could not accept that his war, or the German patriot, should be fought from the safety of a warehouse, and God knows how many soldiers in the trenches instead would have preferred to be there. Richthofen requested a transfer to the burgeoning Air Force, explicitly stating in his application, albeit with a touch of unprofessionalism, that, quote, "I did not go to war to count cheese and eggs, but for other purposes." Despite the arrogance of this tone, considering he was a nobleman, his request was granted, and in May 1915, Manfred began his service in the German Reich Air Force. At that time, he, like many, had little knowledge of airplanes. Actually, he was completely unaware of, say, things that even amateurs know today, such as the fact that German aircraft bore a cross for the identification, while enemy planes were marked with a circle. Nevertheless, Richthofen's fascination with flying machines had captivated him already as entirely, and each new phase of this experience only intensified his love for aviation. It was really matured at that point. It's as if, in many ways, it had always been there, but just hadn't taken that specific form of an airplane. After having obtained his initial qualifications, Richthofen served as an observer, making his first flights in Russia, but from the passenger seat. He was later transferred to the Channel coast as a part of a bomber crew and then returned to Russia. Right? Should point out, as you know, that military aviation mostly developed at the beginning for reconnaissance purpose. And so there were all these spotting planes that, however, started being vulnerable because there were many, and so they were not conceived for dogfight, for fighting in the first place. Bombers would just unload their ammo. And so fighters were invented to start targeting them because the response had been enlarging simply this fleet, and obviously with that came the offensive, the aggressive purpose of plane versus plane. Indeed, at this point, Richthofen's greatest ambition, as well as his destiny, was to become such a pilot, specifically a fighter pilot. His encounter with the ace Oswald Bölke solidified such aspiration. Bölke and Max Immelmann, the first of the two to receive the Pour le Mérite decoration, commonly referred to as the Blaue Max due to its blue color, inserted picture of that here too, were the most celebrated fighter pilots of the time, engaged in a personal rivalry to see who could shoot down the most enemy aircraft. They were all very young. At the age of 24, Bölke was 1 year younger than Immelmann and 1 year older than Richthofen. He was not only a skilled aviator, but also a theorist of air combat. We will see now what his tactics were, his precepts were very clear, to the point, and would later become a mentor, in fact, to the new generation of pilots. The Knights of the Sky often had short careers. The reason why we're so young is not just that war is mostly fought by young people, especially when you have such mass levies, but because they died frequently, and so it was very hard to arrive, as actually Richthofen himself did until the end of the war, to die often, in fact, in the sea. And after a brief training period, Manfred completed his first solo flight. We are on December 10th, 1950. However, his flying abilities didn't shine through immediately. As a matter of fact, he damaged the aircraft during landing. But you also got to understand this. By the way, we'll see how these planes, types and versions were changing constantly. So eventually we know the Fokker DR-1 becoming the emblem of the Red Baron, but actually there were so many different planes and a great dose of experimentalism in the actual testing. Of course, like these planes had already been tested for for staying in the air, but fighting with them and adapting to this ever-changing military combat environment really is another thing. And these were the people who were going for it, like in the fray, veritably. Richthofen finally obtained his pilot's license on his third attempt on December the 24th, 1915, and was initially assigned to a bomber squadron. Oswald Bölke, looking to form a new unit dedicated solely to aerial combat, recruited Richthofen along with other pilots. This was the Jagdstaffel, the Jasta II, established on August the 10th, 1916. And the unit would become essentially a training ground for Germany's top fighter pilots. Some survivors went on to be prominent figures in the Luftwaffe. The first ace pilots of the Great War had operated as lone wolves, prowling the skies for enemies to shoot down, often engaging legendary dogfights. Fighting was really archaic in many ways. You had literally to come close to, of course, the performance of these planes were limited to an extent, but They had literally to gun each other down very close range. It was all a technique. Today we'll not talk specifically about this. We'll just see both because points are quite interesting. And it also tells you how bloody, in fact, these engagements really were, how physical almost. It was as if, you had been wrestling, almost touching the enemy to an extent, using pistols even at short range against enemy aircraft. However, aerial tactics were obviously to develop into some more collective fashion, and in fact, Bölke, in contrast to this past of lone wolves, of single flyers and fighters, promoted formation tactics, where a squadron leader acted as the primary hunter while wingmen protected him, which wouldn't really change up to this point. Richthofen embraced this strategy and soon became its most successful practitioner. On June the 18th, 1916, Max Immelmann was downed after achieving 15 confirmed victories. On October the 28th of the same year, Bölke also met a tragic end, having reached 40 victories. These people died, of course, in combat. Richthofen was destined to carry on and even surpassed their remarkable legacies. In January 1917, after achieving his 16th combat victory, Manfred von Richthofen was awarded the prestigious Blauer Max and appointed to lead die Jasta 11, to which also, for example, Hermann Göring would participate. However, aerial tactics were obviously to develop into some more collective fashion, and in fact, Bölke, in contrast to this past of lone wolves, of single flyers and fighters, promoted formation tactics, where a squadron leader acted as the primary hunter while wingmen protected him, which wouldn't really change up to this point. Richthofen embraced this strategy and soon became its most successful practitioner. Let's read for a while Bölke's 8 rules for mastering aerial combat. All right. Remember that Bölke established himself as a pioneer in the theory of aerial warfare tactics. So they're very simple points, but quite straightforward. So, first, strive to achieve the optimal position before launching your attack, preferably with the sun behind you. All right. Consider that there were these fighters, sort of like the pilot and the gunner in the rear, that therefore when you had someone on your tail would be from a relatively advantageous position to gunning down, especially if he was, of course, above, coming from the above, and he didn't have to fly in the meanwhile. Of course, things towards the end of the war would go towards the main problem was actually shooting through the pales of the helix by synchronizing them for this purpose. Then eventually, as you know, machine guns tended to be shifted along the wings as the structures became more resistant, but it took a long time. And so, of course, if you had the sun behind you, the gunner would be blinded. You would have an easy, but you couldn't quite. In fact, these are just advice, the points, that not, of course, how you had to fight in the first place. And it's obvious that in order to gun an airplane down, you have to remain out of any sort of corner that can be sort of dangerous, because at least it's otherwise like just a Russian roulette. In World War II, as you know, the updated fighters didn't have a gunner anymore. You had bombers, something closer to the fighter if you look at the Stuk as a sort of different. I think about the Mosquito, etc. But those are heavier, less wieldy, etc. So they are proper bombers. As a matter of fact, again, we'll talk about that word that is quite fascinating to me. But there was also before. It's important to stress like the continuity, like how things evolved in the way they did. Then point 2. Once you initiate an attack, commit to seeing it through to completion. This is, I imagine, mostly matter of, don't expose yourself too much. It's not much about, okay, I will stay there until I gun the guy down. Yes, that is also like a general, don't waste time during the mission as a whole. It is, of course, optimally strike the enemy, take him down as quickly as you can. Point 3. Open fire only at close range and when your target is directly within your sights, which may sound banal, but actually for any warpilot is a very important advice. Like, don't wait. They had also very limited ammo in general, and of course the shooting had to be it was more surgical than it would become later. Already by World War II, say gunning somebody down entailed like just being into specific vectors with very high speed and forces. Was mostly roll the dice. You can go slower, but unless we're talking about a defenseless bomber without gunners, like you have to be careful. Also try to get out of the way quickly, because those those positioned gunners on the plane are more advantaged than you at shooting. Then always maintain visual, this is number 4, visual contact with your opponent while remaining vigilant and not falling for their feints, because of course they were playing a bit cat and mouse, but also with baits, and so as we're saying, the same objective was one of the most aware pilots of such cooperative fighting. 5. In any attack, it is essential to engage your opponent from a position behind them. This is essential also because in many ways that's sort of the only way you can do it. Yes, you can come at them frontally, and you can hope even just to damage, for example, these beautiful engines that I put some pictures of more quickly. But here the idea is that it is actually fairly risky, and it is, but not necessarily more risky than being on an enemy tail. There is a gunner out there. As we'll see, also Richthofen will have something to say about it. It's mostly about not wasting time. It's about programming. This is what the advice is about. Getting, say, the quickest way to a safe position to fire from, in order to be sure that you can deliver your firepower on the enemy quickly, safely, and getting out of the way. 6. If your opponent dives towards you, resist the temptation to maneuver around them. Instead, aim straight at them. Right. So if the enemy does try that sort of diabolical approach, don't back down. Right. Try to exploit this. This is actually very bold as a concept, but it was also functional, because it was also a matter of mental strength, right? That is going to weigh on you, and sort of, if you go down morally, you also become more frail mentally, and things can start cascading in a pretty ruinous way. 7. When operating behind enemy lines, always keep your escape route in mind. This is relevant because, as we will see, AA guns were pretty lethal, and you had to be aware of what was under you, finding a pathway across the enemy lines to come back. And this is really very relatable also in later times, right? As also AA guns became ever more performing. And then the last advice for squadron operations, it is generally advisable to attack in formations of 4 to 6, be cautious about concentrating too many allies on a single opponent with the battle turns into individual duels, which of course is a simple mathematical principle that of course makes a lot of sense. Like if you have of course a numerical advantage in absolute terms, don't waste it, but in relative terms be aware that if maybe there is a guy they are fighting against another fighter alone and you have an advantage of 3 to 1, you may want to distribute things more evenly, even though here this is just a general advice. With 3 to 1 you can more easily down an enemy and maybe buy time, so you can never really say this, there's no such deterministic thing, but the fact that this was still an advice in relative terms is important because it shows that these attacks were almost as if these planes hooked one another in psychological ways that could lead you astray from the more lucid coup d'oeil regarding what was happening. And it's very difficult to understand what's happening in the air, right? Things happen very fast. It's a broad space. You're looking at multiple dimensions. You have blind spots. You don't really have a communication system between the various. You have to go by sight most of the times only. So it's really important to see what's going on. Of course, your gunner is deputed to inform you what's going on. This is also very equestrian in a very knightly nature. It's as if there was the knight and the squire, as it happened in the Middle Ages, literally, especially with the great helmeted knights that had pretty reduced sight. This is not really the case, but in general, as we said, the space has complicated to an extent. Said look left, look right, and supporting one another. On June the 18th, 1916, Max Immelmann was downed after achieving 15 confirmed victories. On October the 28th of the same year, Boelke also met a tragic end, having reached 40 victories. These people died, of course, in combat. Richthofen was destined to carry on and even surpassed their remarkable legacies. In January 1917, after achieving his 16th combat victory, Manfred von Richthofen was awarded the prestigious Blaue Max and appointed to lead the D.II, to which also, for example, Hermann Göring would be a member of D.II. Under Richthofen's command, the squadron quickly transformed into the most feared and efficient German air unit, hence also the Legion. That's probably where the Red Baron is born. In fact, during this period, Richthofen's Albatros D.II was painted in its iconic red livery for the first time, and that's what earned him the moniker. But Richthofen did not fly only, or from that point onwards, red or even completely red painted, even at some point planes. It depended. Were also many other colors. Everything was so flamboyant in a way, both for the large amount of color variety of the planes, the fact that the unit would move different places along the front by the command order, and the fact that they encamped with these tents, etc. They would also be known famously as the Flying Circus, right? However, there was definitely a preference from Richthofen's side for the striking red color, because it first of all made it easy for his comrades to spot him as they supported him in aerial maneuvers, and there was some sense of bravery and again, yes, I want to be recognized. It's also, you see, very chivalric, like the customization of the appearance, the necessity of being easily spottable, all pertaining to a military dimension that is so much more empirically primitive than the one that we are habituated to. The idea of camouflaging was there as well, but it wasn't so pronounced in this specific context because of the different sort of weapons performance, for instance, again, compared to World War II, for example. In just 4 months, Richthofen secured an astonishing additional 36 victories, 22 of which occurred in April alone, a month that would in fact become notorious as the Bloody April of the Royal Flying Corps. There was literally, again, this competition of sort of packed wolves, counting how many planes were down. There is a very interesting history of the complications of the nuance of how these hits were counted, because some of them, if for example, if they were down in enemy territory, it was difficult, like unless there weren't proper witnesses to know, to confirm the downing, to attribute it, etc. So you may never know, right? There were planes that, of course, were hit at a point in the flight, maybe for that reason crashed at the landing, or in a moment that could not be seen. And in fact, this is all debatable, but of course the general numbers here are also reliable. And again, there is a very interesting history behind this. We could talk about it sometimes, unfortunately not today. In any case, such remarkable achievement led the German High Command to assign Richthofen the first wing of the German Air Force, the Jagdgeschwader 1, which included Jasta 4, 6, 10, and 11. The objective was to create a unit powerful enough to achieve total air superiority in key areas along the front. So massive responsibility, massive engagements required a lot of control, discipline, cooperation, and also like a much greater, let's say, awareness of the dimension of the losses, of the forces, of the energies distribution, etc. So something much more complicated that hadn't ever actually been tried in aerial warfare at that point. Richthofen was not only a leader, but also a teacher himself. As we've seen, he had been taught by other pilots back in the day. He was thus an inspiring figure for the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1. Under his influence, these men began to paint their aircraft in vibrant colors as well. This was a way to coordinate each other better, because there were many, but not so many that they wouldn't be recognized by their colleagues. So in this bigger circus, Flying Circus, they would have been sort of better evidence, and so recognized, knowing, especially from the leader's side, whom he would rely on, having sort of a immediate understanding of the situation. Plus, there was definitely a moral component to it, because not only, as you have understood, the machinery here was definitely secondary to the human element, but as a whole, this colorful cloud represented a veritable challenge, right, to the enemy, a sort of provocation. While the name of Flying Circus had a playful connotation as well, it soon in fact became a nightmare for enemy air forces. Richthofen instilled in his pilots a fundamental rule for combat, that is, aim for the man and don't miss. See, compared to Boke, how much more directly cutting to the chase it was. If you're engaging a two-seater, target the observer first. Don't concern yourself with the pilot until you have silenced the gun. It's an incredibly powerful statement. He would go down in history with such motto, device at least, that is incredibly more practical and bloody. As a matter of fact, we'll see now, even just probably for the man that he had become throughout these years of killing. It's definitely important to remember some of the planes that the Red Baron flew during these years. In fact, Manfred von Richthofen's legendary status is closely associated, as we pointed out, with the Fokker DR-1 triplane, so it has 3 wings, one above the other. It's very iconic. In reality, he only flew this aircraft during the latter part of his career, securing 19 of his 80 aerial victories with it, which is still remarkable. And of course, it's the most mature Richthofen, and so in a sense his aircraft also throughout, in fact, the development of such machines during the war. However, you have other very famous planes, the Albatros, the D.II. With this, Richthofen achieved 17 victories. This was a formidable biplane reaching speeds of 175 kilometers per hour. It was equipped with two synchronized 7.92 millimeters machine guns. And despite the impressive speed for the time, it lacked agility and maneuverability, which is always a problem in a sense if you favor that sense speed aerodynamics, but say you have thus much more attrition to steer. You have the Albrecht, the D.II. with 12 victories achieved by Richthofen through it. This was also Oswald Bölke's preferred biplane, notable for its exceptional maneuverability and climbing ability, which was in fact a different thing from the previous Albatros. By the way, this model was entirely painted blue. Then you have the Albatros D.II. This was also very highly maneuverable. It collected 23 victories, was capable of rapid ascent and boasting a maximum speed of 175 kilometers, so you see it was improving on the previous model, along with an extensive flight range, which again mirrors how gradually aerial technology was sort of learning from mistakes and sort of improving what we could and creating ever more comprehensively performing machine. Then you have the Albatros D.V. with only 9 victories. This biplane was not particularly successful. It aimed to address the shortcomings of its predecessors, but ended up being even more flawed and prone to mechanical issues as well that were always sort of, at this point planes were still, even though in series and industrially produced, like sort of gradually, say, customized to an extent. And speaking of the Fokker der 1, Richthofen achieved a total of 19 victories, as we said before, including 2 with its prototype. That was the Fokker FE. Richthofen received the triplane for evaluation and was instantly impressed by its capabilities, so that we can argue that it was really his favorite and the one he died in, right? Also, combat in itself here, aside from the machine performance, of course, it's the fighting that really matters. In fact, Richthofen's time at the helm of the Flying Circus was cut short on July the 6th, 1917, when Richthofen sustained serious head injuries during combat, requiring multiple surgeries to remove bone fragments from his wound. Just 10 days after the incident, he expressed his desire to return to his unit, but he was forced to request a period of convalescence due to ongoing symptoms, including nausea and headaches after flight, that would actually never abandon him. There is, in fact, a speculation that even his death was caused by the degeneration of his psychophysical capacities started by this specific trauma and the general burnout that was logerating his capacities altogether. This is very important. There wasn't too much awareness about such general stress disorder, and also just the type of war here was new in many ways. I mean, World War I would be, as you know, traumatic in unprecedented ways, if anything. It's only, by the way, at the end of World War II and more awareness towards the psychological side of the story is attributed. I have very personal opinions on the topic that I will express at some other point. During his recovery, at the urging of his superiors and the German nation, the imperial government, the national propaganda, Richthofen began writing his memoirs. Right? They had previously attempted to craft a heroic narrative around Immelmann to boost German morale, and Richthofen was seen as destined for a similar propaganda role. Nevertheless, he preferred to put his autobiography aside in favor of returning to the skies. Nevertheless, this work remains as sort of his intellectual testament, say, the way he saw war, and we know that, as we said at the beginning, this biography was heavily censored in many parts of the saying that didn't seem to fit the general war fort narrative that Germany was pursuing specifically, and it's complex and complicated. However, we have very poignant passages. For example, in one he reflected, quote, "I am in wretched spirits after every aerial combat. I believe that the war is not as the people at home imagine it, with hurrahs and roars. It is very serious, very grim." Right? So that even, of course, in this more heavenly Uranian, Apollonian dimension of the skies, right, liberating above the misery of the rotten corpses and massed in the trenches, gassed, burned, shot, machine gun, or even bombarded from the sky, because this is what was happening. Actually, the same brutality, of course, of aerial combat was that stern and grim and brutal. You had to come back on land anyway, right? This is, if you think about it, for an aviator, always not just an important concern, but it's also a metaphor, generally speaking, of this effort, this daring Icarian effort that, however, risks that much. And these people were really doing something that mankind had never done before, and really reaching that limit, knowing many ways, as we've seen empirically, just by personal experience at large, what this deal really was. And aviation was in its infancy still. When Richthofen's mother once asked him why he risked his life daily, he replied, surprisingly, or maybe not, "For the men in the trenches. I want to ease his hardship by keeping enemy flyers away from him," which messages an extraordinary awareness of what trench warfare actually was. Even from this aerial perspective, of course, as we've seen, he had fought on land as well, but for most of the Great War's carnage, he had seen this, of course, from the sky. And it's not like uninteresting things were actually happening. In the final months of his life, Richthofen primarily piloted, as we've seen, the Fokker der 1. It was a triplane which became indelibly linked to his legacy for that specific shape and color, even though, as we've seen, this could be more varied than we think. With this aircraft, we said it, he secured 19 additional victories at the end of his career, further cementing his reputation as the greatest ace in aviation history. Unmatched and unique, right? There were also, of course, others who did better. That it was not even about his age, but it was just about the broader context and how relevant these downings really were in that specific moment of aviation history. Richthofen was often portrayed as aloof, emotionally detached, and somewhat serious. Right? Although some of his peers offered alternative views, maybe he was really that cold and almost, again, not emotionless, evidently, but it's also sort of a person who thought quite granitically, not in the sense of, say, inflexibility, but in a way that was moved by such powerful forces as much as the ones that could be mastered by these airplanes mechanically, that it was very difficult to understand in a broader sense. As you understand, he was misunderstood by his family to a degree. He was misunderstood by his colleagues. There is something melancholic resonating in him, this grim view of the war and the general transformation, you can say, like as a trend from some sort of more, ambitious, like at least willing to fight individual, to someone who is reflecting on just the misery of warfare and is looking at is trying to find an answer of what his mission is here, and answering that it gets down to the humble rank and file guy in the trenches, to see, if anything, for a moment, just this is the most important aspect of it all, that by seeing this red plane in the air, imagine like in the what it meant to live in a trench, right? Even more than dying in a trench, right? By far, it was recognized it was much worse just to wait than to actually go over the top, right? And thinking these moments of dead monotony, this sort of still, this few moments of silence along the front lines, say between continuous bombardments, noises even far away, explosions, and machine gun fire, what it meant to see a plane like this to pass above, and showing that there was something above. There were people, like literally, like Saving Private Ryan, angels on your shoulders, as guardian angels, deliverers of that, but remembering that there is a higher world, that life is not just about that muddy, chthonic blood, the disaster that trench warfare really was. If you want, it's part of the doctrine of the true natures that we investigated just recently, right? So that never underestimate the traditional meaning. Does not concentrate too much on the mechanical side of the story, material, how fast did this shoot, or how, what range it had. It's always and primarily about moral forces, and these moral forces archetypically function in very precise and sort of timeless ways. In another passage from Richthofen's biography, we find, my father distinguishes between a sportsman and a butcher. The latter shoots for pleasure. When I shoot down an Englishman, my hunting satisfaction lasts only a quarter of an hour. Consequently, I cannot manage to bring down 2 Englishmen in quick succession. When one of them goes down, I feel a profound sense of fulfillment. Only much later have I learned to suppress that instinct and have become a butcher. This is terrifying, right? He is basically saying that he could feel that satisfaction from having down an enemy, and yes, as a broader effort, right? It's terrible. It's not really that he's saying, I just like it, as we've seen it. It's something grim, and even in the satisfaction downing an enemy, there is of course a positive application of some sort. And what he's saying, for 15 minutes, I'm so grateful I had taken down this guy. I'm so satisfied about myself and the general situation that I can't wait before killing someone. Now, I've learned to suppress that sentiment that, as you see, it's not like a humanitarian, a peaceful one, one of mercy at all. Actually, he's saying that he's enjoying that killing, but now there is something pressuring about the rhythm of this aerial warfare that is not less horrendous than one of the trenches, after all, that forces him to kill without any time for even enjoying that success, or that, even just think about the pressure, the fear, the adrenaline, etc. Like it's something nerve-wracking. And again, regarding the performance of the same Red Baron, it's being really said that the reason why he, well, as we will see now, it wasn't really about that, but the things had started degenerating, and so that they could have gone differently had it been in another condition. All right, but this passage is beautiful because it also illustrates how committed he actually was to the German cause of the war. And never think again that the silly narrative about, oh look, there's the German and the British soldier that exchanged photos of home, and these people hated each other guts, right? This sort of I don't even want to qualify it, but the tendency that it's pathetic, really. It ignores entirely what World War I was as a whole. It's just a fourth estate or mental disturbance and superstitious weakening of mindset. These people were tough as hell, and their purpose there, politically, historically, nationally, culturally, anthropologically, was to kill one another, and exactly for those very values and for something that they hope to gain out of that. Right. So the grimness is not, oh my God, yeah, the war is bad. No, there are meanings to things. Right? You can screw up in a war, you can do bad things. There can't be a general sense of, I'm fighting against another human being, but it's not how wars are fought in the first place, because if that was the case, it wouldn't even be a war, as a matter of fact. And no, there aren't psychopaths in command. Like, people in command are generally actually much better in terms of judgment, capacity, and competence than people in below. And actually, they have an excruciatingly higher burden than them, right? Even those who get actually killed in the front lines do not know what it means to handle a pressure being in the head of general staff. We will talk more about this myth of the butchers, because it's become really clownesque to the degree that it has spread among people without any trace of literacy about warfare in general, political culture, even before the specifics of World War I. Now, at 11 o'clock, 11 a.m. On April the 21st, 1918, Richthofen's time would come. In the skies where he had once claimed victory, he met his demise. There was something, again, really meaningful in this, in a broader meta-historical sense. Richthofen was pursuing a Canadian pilot at an exceptionally low altitude, when his companion, this was a very risky thing, as we will see now, and that's also partly of the idea of losing it, not reasoning more strategically, like being also chasing an enemy like, close to his lines, was a pretty dangerous business, and it's not easy when you're out there. Even if you're a very experienced pilot, you know what you're going through. You're risking. You have done it other times. It's a matter of calculating probabilities. It's never like excluding the risk. There's no such thing, right? But it may have been a mistake in this sense, and because of the general psychophysical condition of the Red Baron. The companion of this Canadian pilot chased by Richthofen was Lieutenant Arthur Brown, who rushed to, in fact, his comrade's assistance, diving towards the relentless Red aircraft. However, Brown's attack proved ineffective, forcing him to ascend to a higher altitude, while Richthofen continued his pursuit undeterred. During this 2-minute acrobatic duel that was really dangerous with the Earth so close, Richthofen's aircraft suddenly became erratic. Unable to regain control, the Red Baron attempted a forced landing, and this desperate maneuver failed, and the renowned ace crashed to the ground. So, this would be also typical behavior when you see an enemy, a plane that has is going just his own way without being, like, it mostly follows a curve. The engine, if the engine is not damaged, it's on, etc. It's basically just sometimes even going up, right? But just in a way that you see it's not directed by the pilot, because it's so regularly just following some parabolas and not moving. You see that it's not doing anything. You can understand that something has happened to the pilot at that point. By the way, on the crashing site, it said that Australian soldiers approached the wreckage, and since they knew that they recognized the Red Baron plane, they began to salvage parts of such iconic aircraft as souvenirs, as mementos. Although the act of downing Richthofen was militarily attributed to Brown, who received the Distinguished Service Cross for the accomplishments. Actually, he did not shoot down the Red Baron. There were immediately doubts. Now, today we know essentially what happened. Also because, of course, we can never fully understand the sequence of events, but the causes of Richthofen's death are pretty clear. Also because his body was recovered, and he was properly buried, first locally, then Germany got it back at a point. And so Richthofen's body was analyzed, and we know exactly what killed him. All right. Essentially, it was a solitary .303 caliber bullet that struck the Red Baron, entering beneath his right armpit and exiting on the left side of his chest, puncturing his lungs, and shattering his heart as well. You immediately understand, especially because in this moment the plane, we assume it was flying straight right with it below towards the ground, etc. This trajectory of entry, aside from all possible causes and weirdness of, say, the randomness of physical explanation, arrived from below, right? So it was not shot by a plane. The Canadian pilot did not shoot. So this was some shot coming from the ground. We know the caliber. So this is British AA gun, right? Somebody came up with the idea, no, there was another soldier that shot with a Lewis gun. No, we know what killed him, all right? Pretty clear. So basically, also Arthur Brown was not the killer of Richthofen. He was gunned by AA fire. Such a wound would have killed the Red Baron within a minute, which is terrifying if you think that you have time to realize what happened, feeling all the pain, a terribly crude end, of course, like the one of so many other pilots, and of course, like the broader, apparently irrelevant in the broader numbers of millions of people killed on the battlefields of the Great War. But definitely this soul leaving its body meant something else in the broader narrative. The Fokker continued to fly for several more minutes before crashing. The author of the hit was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, who used a biker's machine gun as an AA gun, hitting Richthofen twice, first from the front and then from the right. Over the years, as we said, other theories emerged, emphasizing the honor that comes with claiming the legendary ace downfall to begin with, but in fact do not have much substance other than this indirect historical assessment. It's been really observed that the Red Baron was defeated largely due to his own actions. As we said before, flying so low was an open disregard to the tactical precautions that he had himself long preached and practiced leading up to that final confrontation. So we do not know what was going on, whether he lost it for some reason, or maybe he was even searching for death to an extent. Between September 17, 1916 and April 20, 1918, the Red Baron achieved 80 confirmed kills, with many more unverified, which could have brought his total well over 100, which is extraordinary. As we said before, other aces emerged in the skies. Over 150 pilots surpassed his record during World War II, for example. But the legacy of the Red Baron in that time in history, again, with these aircrafts, remained unassailable. In his end, we can see the one of a broader world, the one of, not necessarily of the Junker per se, but definitely of the Second Reich, and of really of a world as we knew it, both for that specific regional national confine of Richthofen, in a place that wouldn't be considerable his country anymore today, but in fact of a broader world that between 1914 and 1918 it was transformed so enormously, also to trigger much bigger changes and even more devastating ones, as you know, in just a generation or less, actually. There is a lot to learn, I think, from the story, and also reflecting about this type of aerial warfare that, as you know, in many political and in fact ideological, but also artistic movements, was becoming the catalyst for this idea of regeneration to an extent. You can read Red Baron's Effort and Death as this sense of almost contrarian attitude, not a non-violent one, but one that was searching for a different way of going, different way also to deliver such enormous power. Think about how futurism was obsessed with airplanes, with speed, with this sense, with this super sense, as we've seen many Nazis to be leaved the hype of the Red Baron's legion, and some of them had actually flown with him. The future of aerial warfare definitely is also one that brought to the capacities of the missile projection in general to a much more devastating degree, not just aerial, just as missiles, for example. It all within, again, the same generation, the same people, and it's almost incredible to imagine, just looking at the pictures of these cadets before the war, how sort of quickly the world changed, and how sort of, in part, a Junker like Richthofen was framed within a quasi-medieval fairy tale world. And so realizing the biological continuity of the survivors and what they did, eventually you can see really how difficult it is to predict, just the outcome of major movements, not merely just a war specifically, but what people can do. The figures like these aces worked really as spearheads, right, showing what could be done, veritable pioneers of the air. This was happening all around the world in connection with major national competitions and more. A word about the other aces of the war. We'll talk about three, right, for the main, especially pilots of the Entente. These were all young, proud, and brave, right? They possessed a deep fascination for flight, aerial combat, needless to say, and they flew primitive aircraft, often crafted from wood and fabric, confronting death in the skies, and many ultimately facing it directly. René Fonck actually was one of the few survivors in this. He was a Frenchman born in 1894. So again, very young man during the war. He is credited with 75 victories, right? His approach to fighting was methodical. He preferred to operate alone, interestingly enough, possessing an intimate knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities, which he fully exploited against isolated targets. It's a very different way of war compared to the ones we've seen, at least regularizing, especially from the German side. Remarkably, Fonck was never wounded, which is really rare, right? Because it's actually very easy to get wounded, on these planes. But this is true also during World War II. Being down, yes, it's sort of easier. But in the moment it happens, it's because your aircraft is hit, and they are incredibly, still by World War II, incredibly fragile structures overall, right? And so Fonck stands out in this way as well. His plane sustained only one hit which is also showing concretely what we just said about his tactics of sort of lone wolf, but also that wouldn't expose himself too much to begin with, still managing to strike so many losses. Funk fired very few shots as a consequence, so all this shooting was actually quite precise. All struck its intended targets. So there are something we've seen in the German initial strategy before Richthofen took over. It's as if Funk predicted instinctively his opponent's trajectory and directed his fire accordingly, which is a great proof of capacity, because ballistically speaking, calculating all the factors, you have to aim slightly ahead the direction that you're calculating the plane to go towards, and that is something that not necessarily every ace has in that precision. Then we have Mick Mannock, born Edward Corringham in Ireland, class 1887, credited with 61 victories. He can be seen, if you want, as the British counterpart to Manfred von Richthofen, both being pioneers in aerial combat tactics. Mannock developed a set of guiding principles that proved invaluable to young British pilots as well. So the knowledge that such masters, such veterans could provide you was really, at the time, like the greatest. Remember that there hadn't been basically any other broader reflection on aerial doctrine, but through what these men were telling you. Yes, of course, there had been, but at levels that when it came to how to fight, alone information really wouldn't find any better explainer than these guys. On July the 26th, 1918, Mannock's aircraft was struck and ignited by German anti-aircraft fire, but he had no time to reach for the revolver he had always carried for emergencies, which is terrifying if you think about it. Yet another AA gun downing. He knew what risk is entailed there, carrying a revolver to take your life out in a matter of seconds. Just think the pressures these men were under just to not to suffer, essentially, more than the usual, but in this case, you know. Then we have the Italian Francesco Baracca, that was at least the most successful Italian ace. There were so many in between, actually, but here we're going by nationality at least. He was credited with 34 victories. He hailed himself from the cavalry, which is, again, another point in common with Richthofen. Born in 1888, Baracca acquired his pilot's license at the age of 24 and epitomized the ideal of the chivalrous fighter. Again, the Ferrari's horse arms come from his aircraft. And he often declared, "It is the machine that I aim for, not the man," which is, again, that knightly in intention, again, this sort of medieval vision of the thing. I'm taking down the plane, I don't want to kill the man, which is also a bit indulgent in the sense that taking down an enemy ace is, if he survives, at least it's not captured, whatever, he's dangerous, he can come back and maybe you can be his next victim. In any case, by the way, the horse the prancing horse on his plane was inspired by that of Stuttgart. That was the birthplace of his fifth defeated opponent. So it was literally coming from a heraldic badge, interestingly enough. So a German opponent. And just for saying how often AA gun would take down this ACES, Baraka met his fate on June the 19th, 1918, as we've seen also with Menach, with Richthofen, say not the very end of the war, but some months away from it. He was shot down at Montello by the Austro-Hungarian anti-aircraft fire. So I am very glad actually to have talked for the first time about aerial warfare, because as I said, I have some pretty strong interest in the subject myself, and I will keep making videos on this topic. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.